The night before the battle, the torches burned low across the Macedonian camp, and somewhere between the crackle of fire and the restless stamping of horses stood a young king, not yet 30, staring into the dark as if he could already see the map of the world bending toward his name. And that king was Alexander, son of Philip, student of Aristotle, conqueror of Persia, and the man history would later crown the Great, undefeated, unstoppable, almost mythic. But here is the question few dare to ask out loud. Was Alexander truly the greatest general who never lost? Or did legend grow larger than reality, polished by storytellers, protected by hero worship, and repeated so often that doubt itself became forbidden? Because when we strip away the marble statues and the glowing titles, what remains is not a god of war, but a human commander who made bold moves, dangerous gambles, brutal decisions, and costly mistakes. Tonight, we begin not with the myth, but with the man. A restless prince born in 356 BC in the rugged kingdom of Macedon, a land the southern Greeks considered half barbaric, half civilized, where power was held with spears, not speeches, and where his father Philip II had already transformed a backward realm into a rising military machine, building a professional army with long pikes, disciplined formations, and shock cavalry. An army that would become the true engine behind Alexander's future victories, though history books often hand all the glory to the son and quietly forget the father who built the sword before it was swung. From childhood, Alexander was fed on epic stories of Achilles and Heracles, taught to believe that destiny was not something to wait for, but something to seize. Under the guidance of Aristotle, he learned philosophy, science, medicine, and politics. Yet education did not soften him. If anything, it sharpened his sense that he was meant for something beyond kingship, beyond borders, beyond limits. When he tamed the wild horse Bucephalus as a boy, not by force, but by understanding its fear of shadows, it became the first public sign that this prince possessed unusual perception and daring, qualities that later commanders would call genius and critics would call reckless luck. When Philip was assassinated, the 20-year-old Alexander took the throne in a storm of suspicion and rebellion, surrounded by rivals, threatened by uprisings, and dismissed by enemies who thought him too young to rule. His first campaigns were not against Persia, but against the Greek city-states and nearby tribes who tested his authority. His response was swift and merciless, none more so than at Thebes, where after revolt he destroyed the city, killed thousands, and sold survivors into slavery. He sent a message written in ash and blood: resistance would not be tolerated. This was not just strategy, it was psychological warfare. And it worked, because fear can sometimes conquer faster than armies. By the time he turned his gaze toward the Persian Empire, the largest superpower of the age, Alexander did not march as an untested dreamer, but as a hardened commander with loyal veterans, a flexible army structure, and a corps of officers who had trained under Philip, men who understood coordinated infantry and cavalry tactics better than most forces on Earth. Yet the scale of what he planned was almost absurd: to invade and defeat an empire stretching from Asia Minor to Egypt to the edges of India. And this is where supporters say greatness begins, while skeptics say myth-making starts. Because bold ambition alone does not equal military brilliance. The question we must keep asking is this: were his victories proof of unmatched genius, or the result of inherited strength, divided enemies, and extraordinary risk that happened to succeed? When Alexander crossed into Asia Minor in 334 BC with roughly 40,000 troops, he was outnumbered by the resources Persia could eventually deploy. But numbers alone do not win wars. Leadership, speed, and coordination do. At the Battle of the Granicus River, he made a decision many of his generals advised against: attacking immediately across difficult terrain instead of waiting. A dangerous move that could have shattered his army before the campaign truly began. Yet he led the charge himself, nearly died in combat, and won. This moment became a pattern repeated across his career: personal bravery at the front line, high-risk engagement, shock impact. the kind of leadership soldiers love and historians admire, but also the kind that walks a razor's edge between heroism and disaster. Because had one spear struck a little truer, the legend would have ended before it began, and no one writes epics about the general who almost succeeded. Victory at Granicus opened Asia Minor, and city after city fell, some by force, some by negotiation. Alexander showed a flexible political mind, sometimes brutal, sometimes diplomatic, often calculating, presenting himself not only as conqueror, but as liberator from Persian rule. Though whether the locals truly felt liberated is another debate rarely highlighted in heroic retellings, because conquest always sounds cleaner from the winner's side. As he advanced, his legend grew faster than his supply lines, and that too matters. Because logistics, food, roads, reinforcements, are the hidden backbone of victory. Alexander benefited from Persian infrastructure even as he dismantled Persian authority, using their roads, treasuries, and administrative systems to fuel further conquest. Which raises another uncomfortable question. How much of his success depended on the very empire he was credited with defeating through pure brilliance alone? Still, momentum matters in war. Belief matters. Narrative matters. And by the time he faced King Darius III directly, Alexander's army believed they were marching with destiny itself, and belief can be as powerful as bronze and steel. The two armies finally saw each other across the plains near Issus, where mountains pressed close to the sea and the battlefield narrowed into a killing corridor. This geography, often overlooked in simple retellings, played directly into Alexander's hands because Darius commanded a far larger force, but could not deploy it fully in such tight ground, turning numerical superiority into crowded confusion. Here we meet one of the central arguments in the overrated debate. How much of Alexander's success came from genius maneuver, and how much came from choosing, or being gifted, favorable conditions? Because great commanders do not just fight well, they position well. At Issus, Alexander again led from the front, driving his companion cavalry like a hammer toward the Persian center, where Darius stood in his chariot. And when the Persian king fled, panic spread faster than orders, and the massive imperial army broke apart, not completely destroyed, but psychologically shattered. This moment, the great king running, became one of the most powerful images in ancient propaganda, repeated by later writers to prove Alexander's superiority. Though modern historians note that ancient battles often turned on morale collapse rather than total battlefield destruction, meaning victory could look more absolute in story than in raw casualty numbers. After Issus, Alexander did something that reveals both strategic intelligence and personal obsession. Instead of chasing Darius immediately to end the war quickly, he turned south along the Mediterranean coast to capture ports and cut Persian naval power. A slower but smarter move, showing that he was not merely a reckless charger, but capable of long-term operational thinking. Yet the siege of Tyre exposed another side of him, a side soaked in fury and pride. Because Tyre, an island fortress city, refused to submit, and what followed was not a swift heroic victory, but a brutal 7-month siege involving massive engineering works, a constructed causeway, naval coordination, repeated assaults, heavy losses, and relentless determination. When the city finally fell, the punishment was savage, thousands killed, thousands enslaved, a reminder that the man later praised as a visionary world unifier could also be merciless beyond measure. Critics argue that we must measure greatness not only by victories won, but by methods used. Because terror can be effective, but it stains legacy. Moving into Egypt, Alexander encountered less resistance and more opportunity, welcomed by some as a liberator from Persian rule, crowned as pharaoh, and declared son of a god after visiting the oracle at Siwa. An event that likely deepened his belief in divine destiny and gradually changed how he saw himself. No longer just king, but something above ordinary rule. This psychological shift matters when judging whether he became overrated. This strike because leaders who begin to believe their own myth often drift from calculated strategy into symbolic conquest. driven less by necessity and more by glory. Yet his founding of Alexandria showed practical vision, creating a city positioned for trade, culture, and control, one of several cities he founded bearing his name. Though most did not grow into greatness and quietly faded, another example of how legend keeps the brightest successes and forgets the quieter failures. The decisive clash came at Gaugamela, a vast open battlefield chosen by Darius specifically to allow full deployment of his superior numbers, including scythed chariots and war elephants. And if Alexander were merely lucky, this is where luck should have ended. Because the terrain favored Persia, the army was larger, and the stakes were final. Yet Alexander adapted, stretching his line, using flexible formations, creating a deliberate gap, and then striking diagonally toward Darius with precision timing, a maneuver still studied in military academies. When the Persian center faltered and Darius again fled, the empire effectively collapsed. Though the battle was harder fought than simple victory speeches suggested, and Macedonian losses were real, and parts of the line nearly broke, details often compressed in heroic summaries, but important when judging true command difficulty. With Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis falling, Alexander became ruler of unimaginable wealth. And here another debate begins, conqueror versus administrator, because winning battles and governing empires require different skills. While Alexander showed flashes of administrative planning, he often relied on existing Persian systems and local officials, keeping structures intact rather than replacing them, which was smart, but also suggests he was not building entirely new governance from scratch, as legends sometimes imply. As campaigns pushed deeper east, resistance changed from organized imperial armies to scattered, stubborn insurgencies, forcing a shift from grand set-piece battles to harsh counterinsurgency warfare, slower, dirtier, and less glorious. During this phase, his army grew tired, stretched, and increasingly multinational, while Alexander adopted more Persian customs, dress, and court rituals, trying to fuse cultures, a move visionary to some and offensive to his Macedonian officers, creating internal tension that rarely appears in simplified victory narratives. It was also during these eastern campaigns that his behavior grew more volatile. The killing of his trusted officer Clatus in a drunken rage shocked even loyal followers. This matters when judging whether the legend inflated the man, because emotional control is part of command quality, and brilliance in maneuver does not erase instability in judgment. Still, campaign after campaign, city after city, he remained undefeated in open battle, which supporters say ends the argument entirely. Undefeated equals greatest. But historians push back, asking what undefeated really measures, because he fought a limited number of major set battles compared to later commanders, often against divided leadership, sometimes against inferior tactical systems, and always with a core professional army forged by Philip. Meaning the scoreboard alone cannot answer the greatness question without context, and context is where myths grow complicated.